Okay, so you want to command a Viking fleet. You are picturing yourself standing at the prow of a sleek dragon-headed longship, the wind howling through a massive square sail, 100 loyal warriors at your back ready to carve out a kingdom or carry home chests overflowing with silver from distant shores. You imagine the glory of the raid, the terror of your enemies, and the boundless wealth waiting just over the horizon. But if you look at the surviving legal codes and the sheer material reality of the 9th century, the math of Norse seafaring tells a much heavier, far more grounded story. Consider the sail alone on just one 90-foot longship, which required over 2 tons of raw sheep fleece and thousands of miles of spun wool yarn, taking a team of skilled weavers using warp-weighted looms more than 3 solid years of daily labor to produce. This means the woven cloth catching the wind actually cost more in terms of sheer labor and agricultural resources than the master-crafted wooden hull floating beneath it. You are not just a warlord. You are the chief executive of a painfully fragile, capital-intensive maritime enterprise, where a single summer storm or a bad batch of pine tar can instantly wipe out the equivalent of a lifetime of a village's agricultural wealth. Let us look at the actual capital expenditure of getting your first vessels into the water. You cannot simply buy a fleet off a lot, as ships are entirely bespoke and require mobilizing an entire regional economy. To build a standard 30-meter warship, similar to the late Viking Age wrecks excavated at Skuldelev, your shipwrights must fell and process roughly 300 mature oak trees. This is not clear-cutting, as the builders need highly specific timber profiles, seeking out towering, perfectly straight trunks for the keel and the long, overlapping strakes alongside naturally curved branches for the internal ribs and knees. Because the Norse do not use saws, every single plank must be split from a whole log using wedges and then painstakingly smoothed down with broadaxes and adzes, a process that wastes an enormous amount of wood, but preserves the natural grain for maximum flexibility in rough seas. Based on historical reconstructions, building the hull alone demands roughly 4,000 hours of skilled labor. In the economy of the time, where value is often measured in weight of silver or in standard units like ounces and marks, a completed warship represents an investment of roughly 40 to 50 marks of silver. To put that into perspective, a hired farmhand in Scandinavia might earn 1 mark of silver for an entire year of back-breaking labor. Therefore, commissioning just one ship requires the equivalent of nearly half a century of a working man's wages, meaning a modest fleet of 5 vessels requires the backing of a powerful chieftain, a king, or a highly organized syndicate of wealthy landowners. Then comes the iron, which in the Viking Age is an extraordinarily expensive and labor-intensive commodity. A single large longship requires between 5,000 and 7,000 individual iron rivets and roves to hold the clinker-built hull together securely. In Scandinavia, procuring this iron means relying heavily on bog iron extraction, a miserable, seasonal process of digging rusty clumps of ore out of peat bogs, roasting them, and then smelting them in clay bloomery furnaces. Producing the 400 kilograms of refined iron needed for one ship consumes entire forests worth of charcoal and thousands of hours of labor at the bellows. The iron alone, for a single vessel, might cost the equivalent of a dozen prime dairy cows, which is a massive transfer of terrestrial wealth into a maritime asset that could sink on its very first outing. And once the iron is forged and the timber is shaped, the entire hull must be sealed. This requires huge quantities of pine tar, produced by slowly smoldering resinous pine roots in large funnel pits. A new longship requires gallons of this tar, mixed with animal hair or moss to caulk the seams, and the ship must be retarred constantly to prevent rot. You are burning through the labor of woodsmen, blacksmiths, charcoal burners, and shipwrights before your vessel even touches the water. But as mentioned, the hull is arguably the more straightforward part of your procurement, because the true bottleneck in your maritime economics is the rigging. We tend to focus on the wood and the iron, but your fleet runs on wool, hemp, and walrus hide. To equip a 5-ship fleet, you need roughly 500 square meters of heavy, tightly woven woolen sailcloth. This requires maintaining flocks totaling thousands of sheep, strictly for their fleece. The shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving is predominantly done by women, representing an invisible but massive labor force holding up the entire Viking phenomenon. A single woman spinning with a drop spindle might produce a few dozen meters of yarn a day, and a large sail requires miles of it. When historians calculate the cost of a longship, the sail and the extensive rigging ropes, often made from horsehair, bast, or highly prized walrus skin, imported at great expense from Greenland or the far north of Norway, frequently match or exceed the value of the ship itself. If a mast breaks and a sail is lost at sea, you have not just lost a piece of equipment, you have lost thousands of hours of accumulated community labor that cannot be quickly replaced, essentially grounding that ship for a season or more until a new sail can be produced or purchased at exorbitant cost. Once your fleet is finally built, rigged, and floating, your largest ongoing operational expense is the crew. You do not employ mindless, loyal henchmen who fight for free out of pure bloodlust. Your oarsmen and warriors are free men, heavily armed, often landowning farmers, skilled tradesmen, or ambitious younger sons, and they operate under strict legal and financial contracts. Viking ventures are fundamentally profit-sharing corporations. While you, as the chieftain and fleet owner, take a larger cut to recoup your massive capital investment, every man on the ship is entitled to a pre-negotiated share of the profits, whether those profits come from peaceful trade, mercenary contracts, or violent plunder. This financial partnership is known as a felag. If you lead your crew into a high-risk situation without a clear payoff, or if you attempt to withhold their rightful shares, you do not just face a mutiny, you face legal retribution at the local assembly, or thing, when you return home, which could result in you being outlawed and your property confiscated. You are managing a volatile workforce of heavily armed shareholders who expect a return on the time they are spending away from their own farms. Feeding this workforce is a logistical nightmare that rigidly dictates your operational range and profit margins. A crew of 50 men on a single ship requires immense caloric intake, especially when rowing against the wind, hauling lines, or enduring freezing rain with no below-deck shelter. An active oarsman needs upwards of 4,000 calories a day. For a standard month-long voyage, a single ship requires over 2 tons of food and fresh water. This typically consists of dried cod, known as stockfish, wheels of hard cheese, heavily salted pork, barrels of butter, and sour milk or weak ale. The sheer volume and weight of these provisions severely limits your cargo capacity. Every barrel of butter you load is a barrel of highly profitable trade goods or stolen silver you cannot bring home. Because you cannot carry enough food for a multi-month expedition, your fleet must constantly stop to forage, hunt, or forcibly extract provisions from local populations, a practice called strandhog. This slows your progress and alerts local authorities to your presence, increasing the risk of your fleet being intercepted by a coordinated defense. So, how do you actually generate the revenue to make this staggering investment worthwhile? The romantic notion is that you simply sail to a wealthy monastery in England or Ireland, kill the lightly armed monks, and carry out chests of gold and silver. While hit-and-run raiding was a highly visible part of the business model, it is incredibly high-risk and unsustainable as a long-term primary revenue stream. Monasteries quickly learn to move their wealth inland, and local kings eventually build fortified bridges and raise professional armies to hunt you down. The real money, the kind of wealth that builds dynasties, comes from trade, extortion, and logistics. A fleet is essentially a massive, mobile cargo hauling business in an era when moving bulk goods over land is practically impossible. If you outfit a fleet of broad-beamed cargo ships, known as knarrs, you can move timber to deforested Iceland, haul incredibly valuable walrus ivory and furs from the Arctic down to the trading hubs of Hedeby or Burka, and trade them for Frankish weapons, Rhenish glass, and most importantly, Islamic silver dirhams flowing up the river networks of Eastern Europe. We must frankly address the darkest and most consistently profitable sector of your maritime economy, which is human trafficking. The capture, transport, and sale of enslaved people, known as thralls, was a primary economic engine of the Viking expansion. A raid on a coastal village in Ireland or Francia might yield some stray silver and livestock, but the true prize was the captives. Human beings were high-value, self-loading cargo. You could sail captives to the massive slave markets in Norse-controlled Dublin, or transport them eastward across the Baltic and down the river systems to sell to Byzantine or Abbasid merchants. A prime, healthy captive could fetch several ounces of silver, equivalent to hundreds of days of agricultural labor back home. By capturing people in the West and trading them in the East for silk, spices, and high-quality crucible steel, your fleet acts as a brutal but highly lucrative arbitrage mechanism, connecting disparate economies across thousands of miles. When you do use your fleet for direct violence, the most profitable strategy is often avoiding combat altogether through large-scale extortion. As your operation scales and you join forces with other chieftains to form a fleet of dozens or even hundreds of ships, you possess a strategic asset that terrifies European monarchs. You can sail up the Seine or the Thames, park your massive fleet outside a wealthy fortified city like Paris or London, and simply demand an exorbitant payment to not attack. This protection money, historically known as Danegeld, is the holy grail of Viking economics. It is pure profit margin with almost zero combat risk. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kings paid out tens of thousands of pounds of silver to Viking fleets just to make them go away. A single successful extortion campaign could yield hundreds of pounds of silver for a fleet commander, instantly paying off the capital cost of the ships and enriching the surviving crew members beyond their wildest dreams. However, expanding into the eastern trade routes introduces an entirely different set of operational costs and fatal risks. If you choose to take your fleet east, navigating the shallow rivers of the Kievan Rus toward the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea, your sleek longships are no longer masters of the open ocean. You must navigate treacherous rapids, the most famous being on the Dnieper River. Because the ships cannot sail up the rapids, your crew must completely unload the cargo, drag the heavy wooden ships over miles of rough land on log rollers, and reload them. This portage process is agonizingly slow, physically ruins your crew, and causes immense wear and tear on the hulls. Furthermore, you must pay heavy tolls to local Slavic or Rus warlords for the right to pass, or hire local pilots to guide you. While your crew is dragging the ships over land, you are highly vulnerable to ambush by nomadic horse archers like the Pechenegs, who know exactly where the portages are, and wait to slaughter weary traders and take their silver and slaves. A single ambush at a river portage can result in the total loss of your fleet, your cargo, and your life. No matter where you sail, the ocean itself is constantly trying to consume your investment. A wooden ship in saltwater is relentlessly attacked by the elements. Shipworm will bore into the oak planks if they are not constantly maintained. And the incredible stresses of ocean swells will loosen the iron rivets, causing the ship to take on water. Therefore, your fleet requires expensive off-season maintenance. You cannot leave longships in the water over the winter, or the freezing ice will crush the hulls. You must build massive dry boathouses called nosts along the shore, drag the heavy ships up the beaches using complex winch systems, and store them securely. Throughout the winter, you must pay shipwrights to replace rotted strakes, forge new rivets, and reapply gallons of expensive pine tar. You also have to safely store the sails in dry conditions to prevent mold from destroying years of weaving labor. The cost of wintering a fleet, feeding your core crew during the lean months, and purchasing repair materials eats heavily into whatever silver or trade goods you manage to secure during the summer sailing season. Furthermore, there is a profound macroeconomic problem you must navigate if you are highly successful. Assuming you survive the storms, the battles, the diseases, and the portages, and you successfully bring chests of silver, hack silver, and foreign coins back to Scandinavia, you face a localized inflation crisis. The Scandinavian economy is relatively small and predominantly agricultural. When dozens of successful Viking crews return to a specific region and simultaneously try to spend their plundered silver, the local supply of silver drastically increases, while the supply of arable land and prime livestock remains exactly the same. Consequently, the purchasing power of your silver plummets. Landowners realize you are flush with cash and raise the price of farmland. You might find that the silver that could have bought a massive estate 20 years ago now barely buys a modest farmstead. This lack of a modern banking system and the volatile nature of the economy is why you see so much wealth simply buried in the ground. When you have successfully liquidated your trade goods or collected your extortion money, you have no secure way to invest it safely. There are no royal banks, and keeping chests of silver in your wooden longhouse makes you a prime target for a midnight raid by a rival chieftain. Therefore, you divide the wealth, place it in ceramic pots or wooden boxes, and bury it in the earth, perhaps memorizing the location using local landmarks or rune stones. The hope is to dig it up when land becomes available or when you need to fund a new ship. But as the massive archaeological finds like the Spillings Hoard on Gotland prove, many owners simply died in battle or at sea, leaving fortunes equivalent to thousands of years of labor rotting in the soil. Ultimately, the true goal of operating a Viking fleet is not to stay at sea forever. The economics of seafaring are too risky, the margins too volatile, and the physical toll too high. The ultimate financial strategy is to use the massive, sudden infusions of liquid wealth from trading and raiding to buy the only asset that actually holds long-term value in the medieval world, which is productive, wealth-generating farmland, transitioning yourself from a high-risk maritime warlord into a secure, landed magnate, safely watching the waves from the shore.